One of the most vicious crimes have risen to unprecedented levels in Britain. Rape allegations have doubled in the past 4 years, but a majority of those accused aren't going behind bars. They continue to live freely amongst us, leaving victims in fear. I'm finding out how committed the police and judicial system are in dealing with this vicious violation.
They had 100 homicides, but 4,600 rapes, but a lot of the resources going to solving homicide and not solving rapes.
Another 5% year on year of resources going to be taken out of the police service.
You hear the people that never reported to anybody else and then they've gone and committed suicide.
If the suspected rapist is not guilty, then it gives the impression that the victim is guilty.
Guilty of what?
Of lying.
No.
Isn't that the impression that it gives?
So this is the
victim?
problem with this type of allegation.
Reports surface about police failing to investigate suspected rapists, leaving victims in danger. Ever since the Savile sex scandal, it's been widely debated about whether or not suspected rapists should remain anonymous.
Name all those that have evidence against them. This will help others who may have been accused by them to come forward. Many guilty.
I'm going to meet a rape survivor who never told authorities what happened to her. Madeline Black agreed to tell me her story. She flew in from her hometown in Glasgow. Madeline was living in London when she was raped.
I was gang raped by 2 Americans. Nobody knew where I was, and I was in a flat with 2 boys, and it became obvious very quickly that they were there to rape me.
What knowledge did you have about them?
I believe that their parents were diplomats and they came to London for 2 years to work. They threatened me, they were very violent, the young men, and they held a knife to my throat and told me that if I told anyone then they would come back and kill me.
What effect did this have on you?
I think I numbed out completely. During the event I was very aware that I had left my body, that I was watching it from a wardrobe which was in the bedroom, and I was just watching the scene down below which went on for many hours, and I numbed out for many years. But in the numbing out, I also had many phobias, many fears. The fear that they would come back and kill me and hurt my family was so strong that I didn't want them to go to the police.
Like Madeline, other survivors fear going to the police will provoke the sex offender, and they're often threatened they'll be killed if they tell anyone. I arranged to talk to a leading charity in London called Rape Crisis, where they prepare survivors for what lies ahead.
Fundamentally, the work that we do here is helping women to recover. So they're coming here to have therapy and go away recovered so they can get on with their lives. It's really important. I think the number of specialist therapists there are in the country are limited. We were under some pressure over the years. We've been under pressure from funders, from the NHS, from the NICE guidelines to reduce the engagement with clients because they wanted turnover. They wanted a lot of people quickly.
Rape crisis centres like this one are finding it increasingly difficult to cope with the high number of rape survivors. Campaigner Jill Soward believes authorities don't appreciate the degree of victim suffering. Jill was 21 when she was raped.
I was at home watching TV. The door went, I didn't even hear it. And my dad answered, and there were men there who forced their way in and were armed. They came in initially, it appeared to burgle the place. But then they took me off separately and I was raped by one of them and sexually assaulted by another. There was sort of a sense in which there was an urgency to get lots of things done to begin with, and then nothing. And just in this suspension, the men have been arrested, you don't know what's going to happen, you don't know what's going on. It's just waiting and waiting.
After a prolonged investigation, the rapist and his accomplice were convicted. Jill was the first survivor to waive her right to anonymity in an effort to help others. She now works as a consultant to the police.
I trained over 2,000 officers. Often the police are giving out very detrimental messages and messages that don't encourage people, A, to come forwards, or B, to feel that they're actually going to be particularly believed or understood. A lot of victims will say that the whole process that follows is like being raped all over again.
For many years, the thought of having children would just be too much for me. When I eventually met my husband, I always told him that I would never have children. To me, in my head, it would just be like being raped again. So I put that idea out of my head. And then we were talking about getting married, and we were married. And then one day I just thought, if I don't have children, then they would have taken away a huge part of my life. And it was in that moment that everything changed, that I started to fight back. So having my 3 daughters was completely empowering for me. I tried to kill myself. I took an overdose and I ended up in a psychiatric unit. I was there for about 6 months. I think they gave me antidepressants, but while I was there, nobody ever asked me, what happened to you?
We've been encouraging more women to come forward and report it. At the same time, the Metropolitan Police have an £800 million budget that they've got to lose. So why are we encouraging more people to come forward if we're not going to have the resources to support women?
There's been a sharp rise in survivors coming forward, but a majority of cases are dropped after the investigation.
The innocence of a suspected rapist often comes from the lack of evidence provided by the police, ultimately leaving the victim disbelieved by the jury in court.
HMIC found that government cuts have led to investigations being shelved. It uncovered that police who were assigned to investigations are not qualified, and emergency calls have been downgraded. The police watchdog says this has led to disturbing practices, calling it a national crisis. I headed to Surrey to meet with the former chair of the Police Federation, Steve White. He said cuts to funding have left police at breaking point, and he gave Theresa May an ultimatum: increase funding or outsource to private companies.
What we've seen over the last 4 to 5 years is that the police service and the level of resources that we have has been severely compromised, and so chief officers are having to make very, very difficult decisions. And whereas in the past we were building up specialist units, Sapphire for example in the Met, we now see a situation where chief officers are having to make the CID departments much broader, much less expert, in order to meet the needs and the demands that they're facing.
Since 2013, reported rapes have risen 150%. Over 70% of cases investigated by police don't go to court.
Rape isn't on the same level as terrorism or murder. It's not really prioritised in the same way, is it?
The way in which violent sexual offences are prioritised by the police service is changing and has changed. Clearly, the Operation U-Tree, the Jimmy Savile investigation, created a spike and a much greater awareness of the size of the problem. And recent examples in terms of Rotherham has only gone to exacerbate that. And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
I was with Louise Pennington, a campaigner who not only thinks people are failing survivors, but they're also blaming them.
In the very high majority of these cases, most of these people haven't done this once. They've raped multiple amounts of times.
Rape has the highest recidivism rate of any crime going, sexual violence. So when we look at 1 in 3 women, probably the latest statistics say, have experienced sexual violence. The average perpetrator commits about 10 rapes before their sort of first formal report goes in. We've been very, very critical of police safety campaigns, particularly at New Year's, which say things like, the West Mercia Police one in 2012 is the best example, where they said, make sure you go home with a friend, so don't regret the next morning. And the image is of a girl who's clearly been raped. Well, rape isn't regret, rape is a crime. And the person these campaigns should be focused on are the perpetrator. They're the ones making an active choice.
Former Sergeant David Eden says police turn a blind eye to sex offence.
Police officers are notoriously poor at keeping lines of communication open. That it could go on for a couple of years, everything that goes with it. It's atrocious, it's soul destroying, and they don't feel supported. I don't think there is a continuity of support. There's an initial contact, and then thereafter I think communications are very bad. I think that support goes away and they're left pretty much on their own.
Why is it that it takes so long?
These things don't get investigated properly and they take time. Normally some form of pressure is being applied and people start to withdraw their allegations.
Do you think in most cases that it ultimately leaves rapists getting away with the crime that they committed?
Yeah, I do. I think there's an awful lot of people that don't get convicted of rape, mainly because 25% of allegations that are made are never recorded and investigated. The massive reduction in street policing numbers. The police forces in England and Wales are on average losing about 2,500 people a year at the moment. I personally know of 3 ex-colleagues that are leaving in the next couple of months to go and be train drivers.
Since 2010, the Tory government cut 20,000 police officers, contributing to the rising helplessness amongst victims.
It's distressing to see that it's victims who feel doubted and helpless from the very system that should be protecting them.
I asked Jill about how people deal with being disbelieved.
People's ignorance can be very, very damaging. And blaming victims just makes the problem even worse for them. And certainly there's a body of research that says that if the first person that a victim tells blames the victim in any way, they won't go on and report it to anybody else. Or when the people who are meant to be helping you, whether it be the police or the courts, seem to be working against you and you don't see justice, it does make life very, very difficult, and it adds to the trauma and it compounds the trauma, and it just makes people feel that they never should have opened their mouth in the first place.
In London in 2014, they had 100 homicides, but 4,600 rapes, but a lot of the resources going to solving homicide and not solving rapes.
A survivor travelled from northern Wales to tell me her story. Her case is still ongoing. She asked me not to reveal her identity. I'm calling her Laura. She was overwhelmed by her trauma and tried to commit suicide.
Once they got me into the room, they proceeded to assault me. He told his friend that I'd be all right because I was trying to fight them off. I'd be all right if it was just him, and to go and wait outside the door to make sure nobody came into the room. There was no escape. I couldn't get back out through the door. And I remember I was just there. I was leant back against something, and he continued to have penetrative sex with me. And all I can remember doing was begging him to stop and thinking how much it was hurting. I was quite in shock when it was going on, in that I'd started at first trying to fight both of them off. But once I realised there was no way I was going to get out, I think all I could kind of think was, if I don't struggle too much, they might not hurt me as much. Afterwards, I was really, really sore. I bath and shower. I'd bath and shower for hours.
We've seen, a rise of over 30% of violent sexual crime over the last 12 months. Have we seen a commensurate rise in resources to deal with that? And I think the answer is probably no. Very, very serious offences such as this, and our ability to deal with them is going to be severely compromised. So I'm not quite sure how the two things marry up. We've got an increase in demand around sexual offences, and we've got a decrease in resource.
There was the huge report in the UK about police officers. Northumbria had, I think, 1/3 of their cases of reported rape between 2010 and 2014 were no crimed. So they hadn't actually investigated. The woman had come in and the police officer had decided that she was lying.
It's insulting, isn't it?
It's denigrating and it's misleading, and it makes them feel like they have to blame themselves. And rape is, the trauma of rape is, we talk about PTSD with soldiers coming in from war zones. We don't talk about that level of post-traumatic stress disorder with rape victims, and it's very, very common with rape victims.
It's estimated that 90% of offenders get away with rape, and 2 women a week are killed by their partners, further to the crime being overlooked by the police.
An independent police complaints commission reported Scotland Yard's Sapphire unit pressured survivors into withdrawing their allegations to help meet crime targets.
The first time I fell pregnant, I begged God nearly every day that it wouldn't be a boy, because I knew that if I gave birth to a child who ever hurt a woman like that, I'd have to kill her myself. I couldn't live with that I'd created a monster. So I begged God every day, and when she was born and they laid her in my arms, you get the rush of love of being a mum anyway, but the fact she was a girl as well, I don't know what I'd have done if it had been a boy. I really don't. I suffer quite badly with depressive illness, and I've been in and out of the psychiatric hospital. I'm on a lot of medication now, and there's all the tablets I'm on to counteract the side effects of those tablets. I've been on this medication now since 2008 when I was in the psychiatric unit. I had several suicide attempts that year, and so they're reluctant to take me down off it while the inquiries are still running. In the end, I got that ill that dying was not the easy way out at all, but it was the only way.
If you actually really take the lid off what's going on and look at the amount and the damage that's being done to our society, to our nation, and you hear the people that they've never reported to anybody else and then they've gone and committed suicide, we know that there are many victims out there who have got very serious problems that are just not heard or are trampled on by authorities.
We see probably another 5% year on year of resources going to be taken out of the police service. And I do fear that we're going to have to start saying no to some of the calls for service.
The police are very unwilling to investigate crimes by very powerful people because low-ranking police officers do not have very much power. The system is weighed in favour of powerful, wealthy defendants, and it always has been.
A small number of Britain's entertainers, the rich and the powerful, have been convicted for sex offence. Campaigners say justice doesn't go far enough.
What does justice mean to you?
I don't think there's any way you can ever fix what's been done. When you thieve off somebody, you can take things that are precious to them, that cause them a lot of distress. But when you rape somebody, you take a part of their soul.
The criminal justice system has historically marginalised women, and I think it still continues to marginalise women. Rape has got to be one of the top 3 worst offences you could ever commit against a person. And then when we see somebody getting relatively small sentences for this enormous violation of another human being compared to somebody getting a much larger sentence in for tax evasion, one really has to question the efficacy of it.
I know how the judicial service works, and I know the chances I would never get a conviction. Lots of women think when they go to the rape trial that it's their rape trial. They don't realise that they won't get a lawyer. You know, many women said to me, but where's my lawyer? And you have to explain that you're a witness in the trial. You're just a witness. It's not about you, it's about him. And it's not an easy process to go through at all.
While legal defence is provided for rape suspects, victims endure great hardship as witnesses in the court, haunted by the traumatic experience for the rest of their lives.
The vast majority of rapists will never be charged, never mind convicted, and if they are convicted, you know, the likelihood of them getting a custodial sentence is actually quite low. We need to be looking at a much longer tariff to show that it's the severity of the crime, that this isn't, you know, like mugging.
What would be the number of years that you would say is sufficient?
It's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, I would think that we should be looking at the kind of life tariffs that you see, you know, the 20 years minimum.
It's an incredibly intimidating environment, and that's something that survivors will be thinking about, as well as coping with the impacts of the trauma that they've experienced.
The survivor's basically a witness, aren't they? And you think that's fair?
It's not fair, and I think the system could be changed and could be improved to give more of an equal balance to the survivor.
It's an archaic, crumbling system with a huge hierarchy of judges right the way down. The strongest cases are getting to court, and even then some of them are being found not guilty. It's a tragedy sometimes for our clients who get not guilty verdicts when we absolutely cannot understand it. The evidence is there.
Am I okay to say about the fact we've only had one conviction in the number of cases?
Well, that's the truth, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
I just wanted to make sure, like,
I know,
with
because the
confidentiality.
CPS will be saying that it's...
The one conviction the centre had seen for their clients in 30 years was alarming.
I'm on my way to Britain's crime capital, Lincolnshire, to speak to a survivor who believes that authorities overlooked her offender for the crime he committed.
The survivor fears for her safety and doesn't want to be named. The man who raped her also resides in Lincolnshire. She's convinced the police destroyed credible evidence that could have led to a stronger case.
He was quite an upstanding person in the community. He was well liked. No one believed that he would do anything like this. He could turn on the charm. I mean, I think that 2 counts of indecent assault for 10 years of daily abuse is absolutely disgusting. He should have got more. It didn't go to a Crown Court, it just stayed at a local magistrate's court. He basically walked out of court with an £84 fine.
He wasn't put on the sex offenders register, and then he could have, you know, he's lived in other places, and there's no indication that he was a sex offender.
No, there was just nothing. I feel totally let down by the police back then and now. I want some answers, which I know I'm never going to get, and I suppose deep down I want some admission. I know I'm never going to get, you know, he's never going to admit that, you know, what he's done is wrong. I know that.
What helped you get through the trauma?
There's still the nightmares every night, there's still flashbacks, but I just take each day as it comes.
Solicitor Rachel Thane has successfully appealed a number of sexual abuse cases, obtaining compensation for survivors.
I see many cases where it gets referred to the CPS and things stop there. So The case never gets tested before a jury. No one ever makes that decision. The case stops at the CPS referral and doesn't go any further. The evidence of the perpetrator, alleged perpetrator, and the victim is never tested in that way, simply because it hasn't got that far.
Why does it stop when it gets to the CPS?
The reason why people are probably blaming, nobody has an answer. It needs to start with a change in our culture and in our society, and I think it will be a ripple effect from there. But until we get that fundamental change in how people view sex crime, sexual abuse, both historic and current, until we have that change, I think we're going to struggle to make those real improvements along the line.
I met with a survivor raped by her stepfather. He's now serving 4 years behind bars.
It started when I was about 3 years old. And there were certain things that, because my dad wasn't around, he started saying, call me dad.
Your stepdad?
Yeah, my stepdad. And then it sort of got worse. He brought me stuff, he brought me a moped. If he brought me something, I would have to repay that. If I didn't, then I would be punished for it.
At the moment, I think a lot of people wouldn't be very fearful of the consequences on themselves. You have cases where people have put themselves in positions of power and trust as a means by which they can then do these acts and get away with it. People are frightened to speak out against these people. Quite often these people are very intelligent, very manipulative. They will groom parents and colleagues in order to put that protective bubble around themselves and then select vulnerable young people or vulnerable people who they think they can abuse in that way and get away with it because they're not going to report it.
The outlook that the court has on the offender, do you think that's something that needs to change? Because there's the argument that the system works very much in favour of the offender.
I think from the perspective that they are presumed innocent until proven guilty, again, in terms of the victim, they're always on the back foot because you're starting from a point that this person is innocent and working back from there. I think in terms of cases where the perpetrator is perhaps in a position of responsibility, there's an awful lot of feeling that the people that do these things are generally very manipulative.
Who was the first person that you told?
It was Frimley Cams. I had an appointment with them. It was my 16th birthday. Me and my mum were in the room. The lady said, "You're acting in a really weird way." And I said, "Well, my stepdad's doing things that I don't want." And she goes, "Right, what we're going to do then is we're going to ring the police." I had to go through filming for the court, loads of tests. It was horrible. It was really, really not nice to go through all that.
With so few convictions, it seemed solicitors defending suspected rapists were almost guaranteed to win in court. Their win leaves victims disbelieved.
If the suspected rapist is not guilty, then it gives the impression that the victim is guilty.
Guilty of what?
Of lying.
No.
Isn't that the impression that it gives?
So this is the
victim?
problem with this type of allegation. There is a huge stigma attached to it from both sides. And it is pretty much a lose-lose situation no matter what happens. The man will have the stigma of he's a rapist. Then there is the potential for that complainant to actually say, well, you know, was she lying or not?
I had clothes that was ripped, like underwear that was ripped, so that was in court as well. And, you know, I had it for 11 years of my life. And the judge basically gave him 8 years, but only 4 years in.
How did that impact your family?
He should have got longer. Everyone has said he should have got longer. Because of the stuff he did, I lost my virginity to him. And that, for a woman, that is it's pure to them. I ran away from home one time and the police come and pick me up. And I said to the police, look, I don't want to go back home, I'm getting abused. They didn't believe me, they took me straight home. And then it happened that night because I told the police and I got punished for it.
The police didn't believe you?
I was about 13.
There's quite an inconsistency throughout the country depending on where you are when you report this, which police force. It's potentially a bit of a lottery as to how you're going to be dealt with. In historic cases, you have huge obstacles in terms of documentation being lost, destroyed, can't be found, and that is a huge problem.
All the evidence they'd collected, the photographs and other evidence had been destroyed. There was nothing, there was only a simple court record to say that he'd been charged.
Destroying evidence is not uncommon by the police. Records show evidence being destroyed or lost after only a year.
If there's evidence, charge them. If there isn't, we're then in this unwanted zone of somebody has been stigmatised as being a rapist. I think it's a bit premature to try and judge somebody in the media, because I've seen it happen. Many of my clients have been judged in the media quite adversely and then acquitted, and yet they still have that stigma attached. They have to walk around their communities and they still have this label, even though they are innocent. Somebody has to be believed over another. And the standard of the proof that has to take place in this country is very, very high. It's one of the highest in the world.
Some would argue that this high standard, that's probably the issue, making it very difficult to prosecute sex offenders.
I agree with you to a certain extent because, as I say, it's when there is one person's word against another, it is difficult because somebody has to be believed over another. There isn't really any independent evidence that could actually support one side or the other.
I know that sometimes life can be a struggle. The government I lead will be driven not by the interests of the privileged few. The mission to make Britain a country that works for everyone means more than fighting these injustices.
Investigative journalist Sonia Poulton holds the establishment responsible for injustices, saying they're the ones who neglect the weak and vulnerable.
Despite Theresa May's very glib words about how this is about finding justice for the victims and survivors, I don't believe a word of it, because if it was, she would absolutely agree without further thought, I believe, to a police amnesty. But actually what we're being told is if people come forward, they will also be prosecuted for turning the other cheek. Corruption exists. The aim is to keep a lid on the corruption, probably until these people die off. We've got so many problems in the justice system that almost the jury is the least of the problems. It's almost everything else comes before it. I believe the only way that we can deal with the establishment is almost effectively to raise the whole lot to the ground and start again. And that includes not being afraid to go above and beyond Parliament, because I'm in no doubt whatsoever that there is an understanding within royal circles about paedophile rings. Jimmy Savile is a perfect example. He's was with both the royal family and parliamentarians. You don't get to go to Chequers Christmas after Christmas unless you've been vetted by the Secret Services. How come Margaret Thatcher didn't know that what she was dealing with was a paedophile of historic proportions? Why would the Queen have asked Jimmy Savile to intervene between Charles and Diana when their wedding was falling apart? He was an ageing DJ, he wasn't a marriage guidance counsellor. So this is a man who was highly involved. He was allowed, did you know, he was allowed to sit in on meetings appointed by the British government to do with trade laws and Israel. So this is a man who was deep within the establishment who we now discover. The truth is that many people knew he was a paedophile when he was alive, but to reveal him when he was alive meant, as he already told us in his book, I'll take them down with me. And that was what it was all about. It's about keeping the lid on it, containing it.
Despite the 22 allegations of offences against 9 victims, Lord Greville Janner wasn't charged. Campaigners, police and MPs accused the Director of Public Prosecution Service, Alison Saunders, of ignoring victim rights. I wanted to know what influences Crown Prosecution Service decision-making and asked to speak to Alison Saunders, but she declined. Police have been angry in the past for not being able to have easy access to investigate politicians. Former Shadow Minister for Policing Jack Dromey thinks fundamental reform is needed.
And never forgetting that the prime purpose of policing is a safer, more cohesive and more just society.
I wanted to ask him what he thought about the rich and powerful getting away with rape.
The police in some cases have been angry that they were not able to investigate a number of politicians in Parliament. There are concerns that the more privileged are protected from being prosecuted for rape. What are your thoughts about that?
No one.
And as an example, Lord Janner.
I think that the Director of Public Prosecutions made a real mistake over Lord Janner.
Do you think something like this should lead to Alison Saunders' resignation?
No, I don't. I think she made a fundamental mistake. On a number of fronts, she has introduced some welcome changes. She got it absolutely wrong in this case. Absolutely wrong. Should she resign because of this one case? No, she shouldn't. Is this a salutary lesson, however, that never again is there any suggestion of somehow, because somebody is a politician, that they're above the law? Absolutely not.
What we're now getting is a two-tier justice system for the UK, and which obviously enables the rich to have justice and the poor not to. The truth is that you often pay for justice, and I've seen that myself. The truth remains is that I would dearly love a Justice Secretary who absolutely meant what he or she said. And the fact remains is that they can tell us anything, as they did prior to any election. They'll do this and they'll do that. But that never is the reality. And we are creating a society which is certainly not only not equal, but becomes actually abusive to those who are not in a position to buy the correct representation.
I met with Brian Dowling, who feels the system lacks assurance for victims' safety. He works on restorative justice, helping victims meet with their offenders in an effort to come to a peaceful resolution.
Since leaving the police service, I've been engaged with restorative justice ever since I retired. In that time, been engaging with other types of offences, sexual offences, some domestic violence, murder cases. I've done quite a few cases.
Your job here is to create a more personal atmosphere and empower the victim.
Yes. I will sit with a victim and ask them how they became aware of what was going to happen to them, which will take them right back to the moment of the crime, which can be, if it's a rape case, it can be very disturbing for them to just go through the answers to those questions. I will then be talking about what they were thinking and how they feel, and they might talk about how they felt under a threat of violence or even death. I will then generally say to a victim at some stage in my preparation process, if the offender was sitting right here now, what would you say to them?
Understandably, the majority of rape survivors wouldn't face their sex offenders. But Rosalind Hollidge made the brave attempt to do so. She asked Brian to help her meet with the man who raped her.
I'd been visiting my husband, who was in hospital at the time. He was due to come out of hospital the next day. Got myself ready for bed, had a bath, got into bed. My 2-year-old was asleep next door in her bedroom, and I was sitting up in bed reading, and I had a landing light on in the hall, and as I was reading, the light in the hallway went out, so there was a gap in the door and I saw the light go out. I thought it was something to do with the light bulbs, and then I thought I'd better just get up and check. And as I got to the bedroom door and put my hand on the door and opened it, a man came at me with a knife. He was jabbing a knife, and I had my hand up to my face where he was jabbing the knife. And the knife cut my hand. He said, "Don't scream," very calm, "Don't scream, you'll wake the baby." He knew that I had a baby in the house, And secondly, he knew that my screams weren't going to be heard by anybody else. I said to him, it's okay, you can take anything you want. And he said, I'm not here to rob you, I'm just the rapist.
The violent rape lasted over an hour, leaving Rosalind scarred on her chest and hands.
He stood in the shadows of the bedroom for a while, and at that point he said, if you move, I'm going to kill you. If you don't move for an hour, if you move, I'm going to kill you. He'd said wait for an hour, and I had a clock by the side of the bed, so I could actually see the minutes ticking over. It was neon clock. I think I waited for about 5 or 10 minutes. No, I don't think it was even that long. And then I couldn't stand it anymore because I was aware of my daughter being next door. So I got up and I started to inch my way out. I grabbed a dressing gown because I was naked, and I started to edge my way out of the bedroom. I thought he was going to come out at me all the time, and made my way down the stairs. And I knew that there was a spare keys hanging on a hook just inside the kitchen door. So I grabbed for the keys, and the minute I did that, I ran barefoot out into the night. It was the neighbours that called the police after that, straight away.
At this point, the children were still at home.
She was at sleepover, thank goodness. But the little one was sound asleep, still in the house. I had panic equipment in my house. I had a tag around my neck because the police thought he was going to come back for me. I couldn't sleep in the house because I was too afraid that he was going to come back. I sometimes slept in my car. I couldn't take a shower because the noise of the shower would drown out if someone was coming in. I wouldn't be able to hear them, so I couldn't shower. I couldn't eat. I'd vomit if I ate. The perpetrator was apprehended 3.5 weeks after the attack. So that's when he was caught. On the day of the trial, the perpetrator pleaded guilty. That was it. It was over for me then. And then it was just a case of the sentencing.
I sometimes wonder whether the people who work in the system allow themselves to get close enough to victims to really understand the pain that they're going through. We can understand what it's perhaps like to have a broken leg, and if you and just to create the image for you, if we can imagine the grinding of the broken bones together and how painful that would feel. Well, when we take a victim of a rape and we take them through a court process and we ask them questions about what this man did to them, and in some cases, some of the offences are really brutal, where victims have been tortured over a period of hours. Now, to take the victim through that again will be the equivalent of grinding those bones.
Sadly, the courts reflect the stereotypical images that we have of people who go into a dock. And we know for a fact now, more now than ever before, that there is such a level of corruption in the judiciary. And so victim blaming is inevitable. And victim blaming runs so deep because people still believe when they look at certain people that they have coming to them whatever comes to them. So, for example, if a woman is dressed a certain way and she's raped, people still believe, even if they don't articulate it anymore because it's not socially acceptable, oftentimes people still believe in their mind, well, look at her, what did she expect?
Sex offenders spend an average of 4 years in prison. It's a common occurrence for them to rape again within the first year of being released.
We have things like theft and drug-related crime. The sentencing for that is far higher than rape.
What we can't have is Theresa May getting up in the House of Commons, often making very good speeches on the need to tackle violence against women and girls, unless the government matches its rhetoric on rape is a terrible crime and should be taken seriously with the reality of resource and determination to have more police officers and more prosecutors investigating rape. Sadly, we will not see progress being made.
Some say the reason why drug-related crime and theft is prioritised higher because it does not make an economic impact on society.
Public policy on sentencing should reflect that. The simple reality.
But that's not the way the judicial system looks at it.
No. Rape is a particularly heinous form of crime. And for me, rape deserves much stronger penalties than is currently the case. I think there's a strong argument for that. Had we been elected, we were proposing to bring forward a Violence Against Women and Girls bill, and one element of that would have been to toughen sentences for rapists.
Why are they not giving them a longer sentence? Why are they not giving them the punishment that they need? Because they're just going to go and do it again.
Many do fear that their rapists, once released, will come and attack them again. Is this something that you're concerned with?
No. When I was younger, I was vulnerable, but now I have grown up to be big enough to look after myself. You can't keep living in fear, because that's just going to ruin your life.
The minute that it was over and I had the phone call to say he's been sentenced, that's the end of that, everyone just went away. That's it, you're left. What do you do with that? It's like 10 times the worst kind of grief you've ever had. The harm inside, like Hiroshima going off, if you were to see inside what someone's feeling, you wouldn't go near them. You'd want to run away from them. You do go through the rage and the guilt and the anger. You're out of control. You don't have any power over this situation. Externally, I had to carry on because I had a family and 2 children, and I was trying to function like I was normal and look as if I was normal.
According to the Safer London Foundation, gangs were switching from knifing their rivals in revenge to raping their partners, because criminal charges and a lengthy jail sentence are so much less likely to rise. Criminals were taking advantage of the low sentencing.
For those who the clock is ticking, for the offender to be released, the rapist to be released from prison, it's probably a nightmare.
Yeah, it is a nightmare. It's an absolute nightmare. It's a recurring nightmare. I vowed that I was going to meet him. Also because his parole hearings have been coming up lately, so there's every chance that he will be released at some point. I started to have a look at how I could go about it. I got turned down flat by probation. I thought, I don't care, if it's the last thing I do, I'm going to get to do this. It took about four months for the whole process to come to fruition and for me to meet him, and that was a year ago. And what I said to him was, I'm here to try and negotiate a way forward. I would like to think that the man that did this to me, who looked me in the eye last year and said to me, I don't want to carry this forward myself. I don't want to carry on the pain. I'm sorry for what I did. I would like to think that he was genuine, but that remains to be seen.
As my journey comes to an end, I learned the battle ahead for survivors would get tougher because of future cuts to deal with the crime. Rape can destroy lives, and legal battles can be brutal. A month after speaking to Jill, I heard news of her passing away from cancer. She was 51. Known for empowering survivors, she aspired to bring change, and challenged policies she called outdated. 6 months had passed since I met with Rosalind and Amanda. The men who raped them had now been released from prison.